How to Read and Understand the Biblical Prophets by Peter J. Gentry. Chapter 2. The End of the Covenant, Judgment and Restoration. As we are learning, one major purpose of the Old Testament prophets was to bring the people back to faithful love and loyalty to Yahweh in the covenant relationship established at Sinai, Exodus 19 through 24, and renewed at Moab, Deuteronomy. Was their ministry a success? By and large, no. This fact leads to important questions closely connected to the lack of real repentance and covenant faithfulness on the part of Israel. In particular, two questions come to mind. 1. Why were the words of the earlier prophets not put into writing as were the words of the later prophets? And 2. Why do we find astounding predictions concerning the future in the writings of the biblical prophets? The role of future predictions in the Old Testament prophets. First, why were the words of the so-called major prophets, example Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, recorded in writing? Many prophets had ministered since the time of Samuel, including great prophets like Elijah and Elisha. Frequently, we consider Isaiah as one of the greatest prophets, but in the Transfiguration it is Moses and Elijah who are talking with Jesus, not Moses and Isaiah. Yet we have nothing in writing attributed directly to Elijah. So why were the words of the earlier prophets not written down, while those of the later prophets were? The answer is that a breaking point was reached in the covenant relationship between Yahweh and Israel. Earlier prophets called the people back to the covenant, but when the people failed to return to the Lord, later prophets announced that the covenant or marriage relationship between Yahweh and Israel was virtually at an end, and therefore God would keep his curses and threats of judgment and punishment. He would also, however, eventually bring about the restoration of his people. How many of us have gone to a grocery store and observed a mother saying to an unruly child for the 10th time, "If you do that again, I'll..." If we keep repeating our threats but don't act on them, we become foolish in the eyes of others. Our promises and threats become meaningless. At some point, we have to act on our threats. The circumstances in the covenant relationship between Yahweh and Israel necessitated future predictions and also required that the messages of the prophets be written down so as to establish the faithfulness of the Lord. There are, in fact, a number of reasons for foretelling the future in the biblical prophets' writings, and these are summarized below. Distinguishing the true God from false gods. First, prediction of the future distinguished Yahweh from the idols worshipped by the nations surrounding Israel and by faithless Israelites. The covenant relationship between Israel and Yahweh is summarized by two requirements or stipulations. 1, love God, and 2, love your neighbor as yourself. As we noted earlier, Israel's covenant violation was evidenced by idolatry, devotion to other gods, and social injustice. Rather than considering the interests of their neighbor and seeking to help others, they were taking advantage of the weaker members of society. Isaiah, in particular, seeks to discredit the false gods and idols worshipped by Israel by proving that they are not gods. This is the focus of Isaiah 40 through 48. The one and only test that proves deity is the ability to both predict and, in fact, control the future. This test remains true today. No advances in our society in science and technology have enabled us to predict the future. This is why the Weather Channel is the most watched television network in America. We all want to know the future, and yet no one knows for sure how to predict and certainly cannot control future events. Validation of the prophet. No one since Moses has had a direct hotline to heaven. During the rebellion against the leadership of Moses in Numbers 12, communication between God and Israel was clearly spelled out. And he, Yahweh, said, "Hear my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Verses 6-8, ESV. God spoke to Moses mouth to mouth. All communication from God given apart from Moses would come through prophets in dreams and visions. This is described in detail in Deuteronomy 18, when Moses is about to die, and Moses makes absolutely clear how Israel may or may not know the divine will after his death. First, in Deuteronomy 18:9-13, Moses shows wrong ways to try to determine the will of God, resorting to mediums, people who practice divination or tell fortunes, those who inquire of the dead for guidance, those who interpret omens to make decisions, and those who engage in sorcery and witchcraft. These methods were commonly used by the nations surrounding Israel as ways of trying to determine the future and find the best plan of action. But in Deuteronomy 18:14-22, Moses shows the right way to know the will of God. God would raise up individuals called prophets from within the ethnic nation of Israel. The prophets would make known the divine will for both individuals and for the nation of Israel as a whole. 2 tests were given for distinguishing a false prophet from a true prophet. 1, the true prophet must speak in the name of Yahweh, and those speaking in the name of other gods must be put to death. 2, if what a prophet predicted came to pass, he was a true prophet. If not, he was a false prophet and had spoken presumptuously. One reason the biblical prophets gave predictions was to demonstrate publicly that only Yahweh knows and determines future events, and such demonstrations required a proper scientific method. Predictions given concerning the future were made known publicly and written down at a specific date and time and attested publicly or verified by witnesses. Later on, when these predictions came true, people would see that Yahweh is indeed able to predict and determine the future. Verifying predictions of the future. So we note that the predictions were to be given in a method that is sound, or even scientific, so to speak. How does this work? Normally, in books like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah, to mention some of the larger works, the prophet made predictions about events that would happen in 2 years or 10 years, sometimes in the near future, in the prophet's own time. When these predictions came true, the prophet was then validated in his community as one speaking for Yahweh and was thus known to be a true prophet. Therefore, when this same prophet spoke about events to happen in the distant future or at some unknown or unspecified point in the future, his hearers would believe that he was indeed speaking for Yahweh, and Yahweh would be attested as the one and only true God against all idols and rivals. In earlier parts of Isaiah, the prophet gives predictions of things that would happen shortly. For example, he predicts the coming of the Assyrians, who will bring destruction upon Judah as a form of divine judgment. Isaiah describes the attack like a big river in flood, Isaiah 8:7-8, saying that the flood would come only to the neck, meaning that God would preserve Jerusalem. Later, in chapters 36 and 37, a messenger of Yahweh destroys 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, and King Sennacherib goes home without complete victory over Judah and Jerusalem. This validated Isaiah as a true prophet in the eyes of his contemporaries. So later, when we read not only that God's people will be exiled from their homeland as the agreed-upon punishment for covenant violation, but that someone named Cyrus would, at a later date, release the people of Judah from captivity, Isaiah's hearers should also believe this prediction, even though it may be far in the future. Here are Isaiah's own words. Who declared it from the beginning, that we might know, and beforehand, that we might say, he is right? There was none who declared it, none who proclaimed, none who heard your words. Isaiah 41:26 ESV. Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. Isaiah 42:9 ESV. Thus says the Lord your Redeemer, who formed you from the womb. I am the Lord who made all things, who alone stretched out the heavens, who spread out the earth by myself, who frustrates the signs of liars, and makes fools of diviners, who turns wise men back and makes their knowledge foolish, who confirms the word of his servant and fulfills the counsel of his messengers, who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and of the cities of Judah, they shall be built, and I will raise up their ruins, and who says to the deep, be dry, I will dry up your rivers, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid. Isaiah 44:24-28 ESV. Remember this and stand firm. Recall to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand. And I will accomplish all my purpose, calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country. I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed, and I will do it. Isaiah 46:8-11 ESV. Just as God foretold to Abraham the enslavement in Egypt and subsequent exodus from Egypt 400 years later, Genesis 15:13-16, so now, through Isaiah, he announces a bigger and better event. His people will be exiled in Babylon and later released, with Jerusalem and the temple being rebuilt. This is the difference between the former things and the new things. Isaiah's prediction is astounding. The superpowers of Isaiah's world were Assyria, Babylonia in the east, and Egypt in the west. Cyrus was from Persia, a land of no significance in the 8th century BC when Isaiah lived and prophesied. Today, with the superpowers being China and the United States, it would be like announcing a deliverer to come from Liechtenstein, a country of no international significance. Isaiah wrote down the prediction he had announced so that later on people could see that Yahweh both knows and determines the future. He alone is God, as Isaiah 46:9 concludes, explaining the exile for later generations. Second, prediction of the future was necessary to explain the exile. Without the messages of the prophets, the people might have concluded that the gods of the nations were more powerful than Yahweh, which was why they had been captured and taken away into exile by these nations. This wrong belief is clearly illustrated in Isaiah 36:16-20 and 37:1-13. During that time period, the Assyrians attacked Judah and Jerusalem and conquered most of the cities of Judah. Today, we have the documents and records from the king of Assyria, which were uncovered by archaeologists. The annals of Sennacherib were recorded on a clay prism on which the Assyrian king states, as for Hezekiah the Judean, I besieged 46 of his fortified walled cities and surrounding smaller towns, which were without number. Using packed-down ramps and applying battering rams, infantry attacks by mines, breaches and siege machines, I conquered them. I took out 200,150 people, young and old, male and female, horses, mules, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep. He himself I locked up in Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. I surrounded him with earthworks and made it unthinkable for him to exit by the city gate. In Isaiah 36 and 37, the commander-general of the Assyrian army, Rabshakeh, gives a message to the people in Jerusalem telling them not to trust in Yahweh and not to let King Hezekiah deceive them by telling them that Yahweh will deliver Jerusalem. Then Rabshakeh gives a list of countries that Assyria has conquered and demonstrates that the gods of those conquered places had been unable to deliver their people. Then Rabshakeh insults and mocks Yahweh, saying that he is no different from the gods of the conquered nations and will not be able to deliver Judah and Jerusalem. The gods of Assyria are bigger and better than Yahweh, Rabshakeh claims. According to Deuteronomy 32:27, this is exactly what Yahweh said the enemies would think. Apart from the prophetic word, imagine what the people of Jerusalem would have thought when the Babylonians came and conquered the city and razed it to the ground, exiling the citizens to Babylon. Imagine undertaking the journey on foot in chains for weeks, perhaps months, and finally arriving in Babylon in a land far away from home. Imagine walking down a corridor of high walls, beautifully decorated, and arriving in the massive Ishtar Gate at the city of Babylon. Archaeologists have reconstructed this gate, and it is displayed in a museum in Berlin. Even today, simply viewing the reconstruction is an overwhelming experience. Were it not for the prophetic word, the people of Judah and Jerusalem would surely have concluded, "Now we know why the Babylonians conquered us. It is because the gods of Babylon are bigger and more powerful than Yahweh." Such a conclusion, of course, would have been utterly wrong. They were conquered for only one reason. They had violated the covenant, and the covenant curses of Deuteronomy 28 had come upon them. God had promised that he would send enemies and kick them out of their land, and he had finally kept his word and done it. God brought the Assyrians and the Babylonians against his own people for violating the covenant. It was necessary then for the predictions of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel to be written down, so that when those events occurred, the people of Israel would draw the right conclusions. Deliverance takes time. Third, the prediction of the future points to the fact that deliverance would take time, which is another reason why certain prophets wrote down their prophecies. There would be no quick fix in Isaiah's lifetime. Isaiah shows that the return of the people to a right relationship to Yahweh would happen in two stages. First, the people would be released from physical exile in Babylon. Second, the people would be released from spiritual exile and slavery to sin. The first return, physical release from Babylon, would take 70 years according to Jeremiah. For roughly 490 years, the people had neglected to give the land its sabbaticals, allotted periods of rest. Therefore, the people would remain exiled, and the land would have its rest for 70 years, one sabbatical for each 7 years, Jeremiah 25. Then another 7 sabbaticals, 490 years, were set to deal with their rebellion and sin and incorrigible covenant disloyalty, Daniel 9:24. Finally, with the coming of the Messiah, Yahweh would circumcise the hearts of his people and make a new covenant in which the people would respond in faith to Yahweh's faithfulness to them. They would receive the forgiveness of sins, the temple would be rebuilt, and God would once more return to live in the midst of his people as king. The messages of the prophets were written down in order to bring great comfort and encouragement during the long, weary years while God worked out his purposes and plan of salvation. Yahweh is sovereign. Fourth, prediction of the future demonstrates the sovereignty of Yahweh over the nations. Not only did the people of Judah and Jerusalem need to see demonstrated and proven that Yahweh knows and predicts the future, but the nations needed to see it as well. The Assyrians, for example, needed to know that it was not their military might and strategy that brought the downfall of Israel. It was due solely to Israel's sin and covenant violation. The Assyrians were simply instruments in the hands of a God who is sovereign over all nations. Not just Israel, but all the surrounding nations too had to see that Yahweh is the only true God, and that any other so-called gods are really just no-names and nothings, not worthy of worship by humans. The word of Yahweh is trustworthy. Fifth, prediction of the future proves the trustworthiness of the word of Yahweh. Hence, his people should believe his promises and his threats in the covenant. He, above all, is a faithful covenant partner. Isaiah 28-37 is all about whether the people will believe and trust the words of Yahweh. The covenant is like a marriage relationship. How can two people continue in an intimate relationship of love when one does not believe or trust anything the other says? Lack of trust leads to the complete breakdown of such a relationship. In the same way, only when the people come to believe and rely upon the word of Yahweh, no matter how unlikely it might seem, a deliverer will come from Liechtenstein, could God and Israel have a covenant relationship of love, of faithfulness and loyalty, of obedience and trust. The prophets wrote down their messages as proof of the reliability of the word of Yahweh for later generations who would eventually be part of the renewal of the covenant relationship. So there are many different reasons for the prophets to predict the future. That is why there is a wide variety of predictions and different ways to describe the future, as we shall soon see. Nonetheless, it is fundamental that we see prediction of the future as integral to the focus on calling Israel to account for covenant violation, since idolatry is at the heart of covenant violation, and the only distinction between false gods and Yahweh is the ability to announce and control the future.